The domestic slave trade is one that begins in 1808. The United States Constitution has 3 times when it talks about enslaved people. It doesn't use any of the words, though. That's the 3/5 clause. It was used for voting population, and so they didn't have any rights, but that way Southerners could maintain that they could have a higher number of representation in the U.S. House of Representatives because they could count their enslaved persons in the population even though they didn't have the right to vote. It's also counted in the Fugitive Slave Act, and so the Fugitive Slave Act is allowed for in the U.S. Constitution. It would become particularly pernicious by 1850 when people were required, whether they were law enforcement or not, to return people back to enslavement. That's why you start to see large number of individuals escaping now to Canada because no space was really free, and then a magistrate was actually paid $10 if they found an enslaved person guilty and $5 if they set them free. So placing them in slavery was actually incentivized. The third portion, to create some type of compromise between the Constitutional Convention, who were slave owners, nearly half of them were, and those who were not, was the end of the African slave trade in 1808. And so it's ratified the Constitution in 1791. By 1808, it says you cannot bring more enslaved people straight from Africa. At the same time, individuals from the North and the Upper South, so we're talking Maryland, Virginia, even New York, New Jersey. People think somehow after the American Revolution, slavery disappeared in New York and New Jersey and other spaces. It did not. They gradually manumitted individuals. At the same time, those spaces were becoming increasingly industrialized. Tobacco had stripped the land of much of its nutrients, and people were beginning to sell their enslaved people down into the South. What's happening in places like Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana? Cotton is becoming king, right? And so Eli Whitney creates the cotton gin that allows for an easier removal of the pod from the host of the cotton, so you can produce more bales of cotton. There are different strains of cotton that are coming along. The Louisiana Purchase opens up space for people to create more plantations, sugar and some rice, as well as cotton plantations. And a bill signed by Andrew Jackson called Indian Removal began what would eventually be the Trail of Tears and the removal of Native Americans from places like Georgia. And so you have all of these things going on at the same time. We need more enslaved people to work on our cotton plantations, to mine the laborious canes of sugar, but we can't import them from West Africa anymore. Well, where should we get them? Well, those in the North are willing to sell them because they are changing their economy. Their staple crops are changing, and you begin a huge and inhumane and horrifying movement of individuals down to the lower South. To give you an idea of how large the domestic slave trade was, there were 435,000 enslaved people in the state of Alabama by the time the Civil War ends in 1865. 300,000 of them were brought here as part of the domestic slave trade. So we have individuals who are disembarking then, if you can imagine, from ships, sometimes 200 feet long ships coming off here, coming off of the trains, at times walking over the land, what we refer to as coffles. There's a very marked increase in abolition at this particular time. People like Frederick Douglass, Ellen Watkins, Harper would write about how devastating it was to watch individuals tied together marching down to the slave ports to come down into the Deep South. It was a death sentence, people often thought of it, not only because of the labor you would entail, but because you're losing your family. So they would be marched here and then marched along this street that we just walked down, and many of them brought to the office of the EJI. New Orleans used to be the largest internal slave market in the South in the early and mid-1800s or 1830s. Closer to the Civil War, Montgomery was the largest slave market in the South. Okay, or in the country, I should say. So why don't we reconvene at EJI?
I'm your child, Lord, while I run this race. I'm your child, Lord, while I run this race. I'm your child, Lord, while I run this race, 'cause I don't want to run this race in vain.
And And so, as I mentioned, when individuals were marched either off of the steamships or off of the train, many of them would end up here. And so the EJI, and if you haven't already, I encourage you to read the markers, was in fact a slave pen during the time. It was owned by John Murphy. And there were a number of slave pens in Montgomery at the time. Slave traders were considered kind of the dingiest, nastiest individuals among society, even among those who would purchase enslaved persons from them. And so they could be housed in a slave pen for a few days, even a few months. While they were in here, their care was relatively good. I use that word very carefully by comparison as to how they may be treated when they arrive where they go. The point was to ensure their health. They would see a doctor very often. There would be a doctor who may float to these different slave pens to make sure that the individual stayed in good health. Why is that? Right. They're going to sell them. They want to keep their profits high. Before they would leave these spaces, they would be clothed, often greased down, and then taken to various slave depots around the city. Sometimes sales would just occur kind of privately, one-on-one, and not on the auction block. The thing that I love, and this is clearly exceptionally intentional, is that this kind of bookend of oppression and debasement and iniquity ends with housing the EJI and the wonderful work that we're seeing. It is the most profound symbol of progress, an idea of how we can change the past and make, or not change the past rather, but take the lessons from the past and make it to affect our present and our future. So I think it is absolutely brilliant that the EJI has chosen to house itself in this space.